There's a photograph in the attic of a farmhouse outside Ashland, Kentucky. It's been there for 87 years. No one in the family talks about it. No one looks at it. But everyone knows it's there. The woman in the picture is sitting on a porch step, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly away from the camera, as if she's listening to something in the distance. Her name was Elsie Harmon. She disappeared 3 days after that photograph was taken. They found her shoes at the edge of the woods. They never found her. But that's not the secret. The secret is what her daughter found in the root cellar 40 years later, wrapped in canvas and buried beneath jars of preserves that had turned black with age. The secret is what the family chose to do with it. And the secret is why, even now, no one who carries that bloodline will walk those hills after dark. This isn't folklore. This isn't ghost story entertainment. This is the kind of history that families bury because the truth is heavier than grief. And once you hear it, you'll understand why some doors were never meant to be opened. Because the past doesn't stay buried, it waits, it watches. And when someone finally digs deep enough, it whispers. The hills around Ashland have been whispering for almost a century, and what they're saying will change the way you think about the people who raised you. Because every family has secrets. But some families have sins, and in 1938, in the abandoned coal towns of eastern Kentucky, one family learned the difference. This is the story of what they found. This is the story of what they did. And this is the story of why the truth was more dangerous than the lie. The Harmon family came to Kentucky in 1902, part of the Great Migration that followed the coal. They weren't miners, they were landowners. Small plot, just enough to grow tobacco and keep chickens, but in those hills, land meant power, and power meant you had something to protect. Elsie was the youngest of 4 daughters. By all accounts, she was quiet, reserved, the kind of woman who kept her thoughts to herself and her eyes on the ground when men were talking. She married young to a man named Thomas Calloway, who worked the rail line that carried coal down from the mines. They had 1 daughter. Her name was Ruth, and Ruth would grow up never knowing her mother's voice. Because in September of 1938, Elsie Harmon walked into those woods and never came back. The search lasted 6 days. They brought dogs. They brought men from 3 counties. They combed every hollow, every creek bed, every deer trail that cut through the timber. All they found were her shoes, set side by side at the base of an old sycamore tree, laces still tied. No blood, no struggle, just the shoes. And in a town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and gossip was religion, the silence that followed her disappearance was deafening. No one speculated. No one theorized. The church held a service without a body. Thomas remarried within 2 years. And Ruth grew up in a house that never spoke her mother's name. But Ruth remembered things, small things. The way her mother used to hum while she worked. The way she'd pause sometimes mid-task and stare out the window toward the tree line as if she were waiting for someone. And Ruth remembered the last thing her mother ever said to her. It was the morning of the day she disappeared. Ruth was 4 years old, playing with a doll on the kitchen floor. Elsie knelt down beside her, touched her hair, and whispered, "If something happens to me, don't let them tell you I left. I would never leave you." Ruth didn't understand, not then, but 40 years later, when she stood in that root cellar with a kerosene lamp in one hand and a canvas-wrapped bundle in the other, she understood perfectly. Ruth Calloway never married. She stayed in that house, the one her father brought his new wife into, the one where her mother's absence hung in the air like smoke you couldn't see but always smelled. By 1978, everyone who'd known Elsie was either dead or didn't want to remember. The town had moved on. The coal had run dry. The young people left for cities with futures. And Ruth, now 44 years old, lived alone in a house that was slowly rotting from the inside out. The roof leaked. The floorboards sagged. And one day in late October, the wooden stairs leading down to the root cellar finally gave way beneath her weight. She fell 6 feet onto packed dirt and broken stone. Bruised her hip, cracked a rib, but she didn't call for help, because when she stood up and raised that lamp, she saw something that made her forget the pain entirely. The root cellar had been sealed off since before she was born. Her father had nailed boards across the entrance when she was a child, told her it was unsafe, told her to stay away. She'd obeyed. For 40 years, she'd obeyed. But now the boards were above her, splintered and useless, and she was standing in a space that hadn't been touched by light in decades. The shelves were still there, lined with jars of preserves so old the glass had turned cloudy. And behind those jars, pushed back into the corner where shadow met stone, was a canvas tarp folded over something the size of a small trunk. She didn't want to touch it. Every instinct in her body told her to climb back up, to leave it buried, to forget she'd ever fallen through those stairs. But her mother's voice was in her head, the last words she'd ever heard. "Don't let them tell you I left." So Ruth pulled the tarp away, and beneath it was a wooden crate, handmade, rough-cut pine, with a rusted padlock that broke apart when she pried it with a stone. Inside the crate were letters, dozens of them, tied with twine, all addressed to Elsie Harmon. And beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal, leather-bound, water-stained, and written in her mother's hand. Ruth sat on that dirt floor for 3 hours. She read every word. And when she climbed back out of that cellar, she was no longer the same woman. Because the letters weren't love letters, they were warnings. And the journal wasn't a diary, it was a record. A record of what her mother had witnessed, a record of what the men in that town had done, and a record of why Elsie Harmon had to die. The journal began in the spring of 1937, more than a year before Elsie disappeared. The entries were careful at first, observations, small details that seemed meaningless on their own. A meeting held after dark at the church, men arriving in groups, leaving their trucks a mile down the road and walking the rest of the way. Her husband Thomas among them, her father-in-law, the sheriff, the doctor, the man who ran the company store, all of them gathering in the church basement while their wives stayed home and pretended not to notice. Elsie didn't write about what they discussed, not at first, because she didn't know, but she wrote about what happened after. A family named Pritchard lived 3 miles up the mountain, black family, sharecroppers who worked land owned by the same coal company that owned half the county. In June of 1937, Daniel Pritchard came to town with a complaint. His daughter, 16 years old, had been assaulted by a white foreman at the company weighing station. He wanted justice. He wanted the law. He went to the sheriff, and 2 weeks later, the Pritchard house burned to the ground. Daniel, his wife, and their 3 children died in the fire. The official report called it an accident. A kerosene lamp knocked over in the night. No investigation, no questions. Just 5 graves on a hillside and a foreman who kept his job. Elsie wrote about the night of the fire. She wrote about Thomas coming home at dawn, smelling like smoke and something else, something chemical. She wrote about the way he wouldn't look at her, the way he scrubbed his hands raw in the basin and told her never to speak of it. And she wrote about the envelope of cash he brought home 3 days later, more money than they'd seen in a year, tucked inside his coat without explanation. That's when she started paying closer attention. That's when the careful observations became something else, because the Pritchard fire wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern, and Elsie Harmon, quiet and reserved and invisible to the men who thought they ruled those hills, had started to see the shape of it. She wrote about the land grabs, families intimidated into selling for pennies, families who refused found their wells poisoned, their livestock dead, their children run off the road on their way to school. She wrote about the night riders, men in hoods who weren't strangers but neighbors, who burned crosses and left warnings and disappeared back into their own homes before sunrise. And she wrote about the money, always the money, distributed after every act of terror, paid out like wages, split among the men who kept the system running. Her husband was one of them, her father-in-law was one of them, and when Elsie realized what she'd married into, she made a decision that would cost her everything. She started copying documents, receipts, land deeds, transfer records from the company store that showed who was paid and when. Her husband kept papers in a lockbox beneath their bed. He thought she didn't know the key was hidden in the bottom of his tobacco tin. But Elsie knew everything. She moved through that house like a ghost, silent and unseen, and every time Thomas left for his shift on the rail line, she went to work. She didn't have a plan, not at first. She just knew that someone needed to see what was happening, someone outside the county, someone who couldn't be bought or threatened into silence. So she wrote letters. She sent them to a reporter in Lexington, a lawyer in Louisville, a minister in Cincinnati who'd spoken out against the Klan. She mailed them from different towns, never the same post office twice, always careful, always watching over her shoulder. But in a place that's small, silence is a currency, and secrets are survival. Someone noticed. Maybe it was the postmaster. Maybe it was a neighbor who saw her on a road she had no reason to be on. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that by the summer of 1938, the men in that church basement knew there was a leak. They knew someone was talking. And when Thomas came home one night in late August, smelling like whiskey and fear, Elsie knew they'd figured out it was her. She wrote about that night in her journal. The last entry. She wrote about the way he looked at her across the table, the way he asked her if she'd been to town that day, the way his voice stayed calm but his hands were shaking. She wrote, "He knows. They all know. And I know what happens to people who know too much in these hills." The next morning, she took Ruth outside to play. She knelt down beside her daughter in the dirt and said the words that would haunt Ruth for the rest of her life. "If something happens to me, don't let them tell you I left. I would never leave you." Then she walked into the woods, and 3 days later they found her shoes. The search was theater. Everyone in town knew it. They went through the motions because that's what you do when someone disappears, but no one expected to find her, and no one wanted to, because finding Elsie meant asking questions, and questions meant answers, and answers meant the whole rotten structure would collapse. So they buried her memory instead. They erased her, and they raised her daughter in a house built on lies, hoping she'd never go looking for the truth. But Ruth did go looking. And now, standing in that root cellar with her mother's journal in her hands, she had a choice to make. She could take what she'd found to the authorities. She could expose the men who'd killed her mother, the ones still living, the sons and grandsons who'd inherited the land and the money and the silence. Or she could do what everyone else in her bloodline had done. She could bury it again. She could walk away. She could pretend she never fell through those stairs. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Ruth chose silence, but not the kind you're thinking. She didn't walk away. She didn't rebury the journal and pretend ignorance was mercy. She read every letter, every document, every name her mother had written down, and then she made copies, careful copies. She took the originals and put them back in the crate, wrapped them in fresh oilcloth, and sealed the root cellar again. She told no one. Not the police, not a lawyer, not even the few distant cousins she still exchanged Christmas cards with, because Ruth understood something her mother hadn't lived long enough to learn. In a town where power runs in bloodlines and justice is whatever the powerful say it is, the truth doesn't set you free, it gets you killed. So she waited. She lived in that house for another 11 years, quiet and invisible, just like her mother had been. She worked at the county library. She kept to herself. And every year on the anniversary of her mother's disappearance, she walked to the edge of those woods and stood where the shoes had been found and promised Elsie that the secret wouldn't die with her. In 1989, Ruth was diagnosed with cancer, stage 4. The doctor gave her 6 months. She made it 8. And in those final weeks, when her body was failing but her mind was still sharp, she did what her mother never had the chance to do. She sent the copies. Not to local authorities, not to anyone in Kentucky. She sent them to the Department of Justice, to the Southern Poverty Law Center, to historians who specialized in racial terror and covered up violence in Appalachia. She sent them with a cover letter that explained everything, who she was, who her mother had been, and what had been buried in those hills for 51 years. The letters arrived after Ruth died. She was buried in the same cemetery as her mother, in a plot she'd purchased years earlier, close enough to Elsie's empty grave that they'd never be separated again. And for a while, it seemed like nothing would come of it. The men her mother had named were long dead. Their sons were old men now, respectable, insulated by time and money and the kind of amnesia that communities develop when the truth is too ugly to acknowledge. But the documents were real. The names were real. The land transactions, the payments, the pattern of violence. It was all there, undeniable, recorded in Elsie Harmon's careful handwriting. And in 1991, 2 years after Ruth's death, a federal investigation was quietly opened. No press conferences, no headlines. Just a small team of investigators going through courthouse records, conducting interviews following a trail that had gone cold half a century earlier. They confirmed what Elsie had documented. The night riders, the murders, the systematic terror campaign designed to force black families off valuable land so it could be seized and resold at profit. They found the financial records. They found descendants of victims who'd been told their grandparents died in accidents, who'd grown up never knowing the truth. And they found something else. The root cellar had been opened again. Not by investigators, by someone else. The crate was gone. The journal was gone. Every physical piece of evidence that Ruth had preserved had vanished. Someone had been watching. Someone had known what Ruth sent out before she died. And someone had made sure the original documents would never see the inside of a courtroom. The investigation stalled. Without the original documents, without physical evidence, the case became a historical footnote. A tragedy acknowledged but never prosecuted. The families of the victims received letters of apology from the federal government. Formal recognition that yes, these crimes had occurred. Yes, the system had failed them. Yes, their ancestors had been murdered for profit. But no one was charged. No land was returned. No restitution was paid. The letters were filed away. The investigation was closed, and the men who'd inherited that blood money, who still lived in those hills, who still owned that land, never spent a single day answering for what their fathers and grandfathers had done. The silence held, just like it always had. But something changed in those hills after Ruth died. The families who'd stayed, the ones who'd never left even after the coal ran out, they started talking. Quietly at first, in church basements and living rooms and late-night phone calls. They started sharing stories their grandparents had told them, stories about fires that weren't accidents, about disappearances that were never solved, about the fear that kept entire communities from speaking up, from fighting back, from demanding justice. And they started asking questions about the land their families had lost, about the wealth that had been stolen, about the names that kept appearing in those old records, names that still held power, that still sat on town councils and school boards and controlled who got loans and who didn't, who got hired and who got passed over. The Harmon house stood empty for years after Ruth's death. No one would buy it. Locals said it was cursed. They said you could hear footsteps in the root cellar at night. They said Elsie's ghost walked the tree line, searching for the justice she'd never received. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying than any ghost story. The house stood empty because everyone knew what had happened there. Everyone knew what it represented, and no one wanted to be the family that moved into a monument to buried sin. In 2004, the house was torn down. The land was sold to a developer from out of state who didn't know the history and didn't care. They built a subdivision, nice homes, young families, people who have no idea what's beneath the soil their children play on. Elsie Harmon's body was never found. The root cellar was filled in when the old house was demolished, sealed beneath concrete and rebar, unreachable now, permanent. If the journal is still down there, if someone hid it in those walls or buried it deeper than Ruth ever knew, it's gone. The only copies that exist are the ones Ruth sent out before she died, scattered across archives and file cabinets, stamped with case numbers that no one remembers. But the story doesn't end with silence. It ends with you. Because you're hearing this now, you're learning what those families tried to bury. And somewhere in Kentucky, in a subdivision built on stolen land, children are growing up never knowing that their swing sets and basketball hoops sit on top of a mass grave of secrets. The past doesn't stay buried. It waits in root cellars and locked boxes and journals written by women who knew they were going to die for telling the truth. It waits for someone brave enough to dig. Elsie Harmon dug. Ruth Calloway dug. And now you know what they found. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Because every family has secrets. But some families have sins. And the only thing more dangerous than knowing the truth is pretending you never heard it. The hills are still whispering. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear them calling your name.